Smile.
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 Please subscribe. Smile politely.
Smile politely.
He shook my hand and smiled politely.
He shook my hand and smiled politely.
Smile warmly.
Smile warmly.
She welcomed us at the door, smiling warmly.
She welcomed us at the door, smiling warmly.
Smile broadly.
Smile broadly.
He sat there smiling broadly.
He sat there smiling broadly.
He smiled broadly when Danny walked in.
He smiled broadly when Danny walked in.
Smile slightly.
Smile slightly.
She smiled slightly back at him.
She smiled slightly back at him.
Make somebody smile.
Make somebody smile.
His comment made her smile.
His comment made her smile.
Try to smile.
Try to smile.
I'm fine, I said, trying to smile.
I'm fine, I said, trying to smile.
She tried to smile through her tears.
She tried to smile through her tears.
Smile at somebody.
Smile at somebody.
The girl in the next seat was smiling at me.
The girl in the next seat was smiling at me.
Smile to yourself.
Smile to yourself.
Malika looked at the photo and smiled to herself.
Malika looked at the photo and smiled to herself.
A big smile, a broad smile.
A big smile, a broad smile.
She came out of the interview with a big smile on her face.
She came out of the interview with a big smile on her face.
They all had broad smiles on their faces.
They all had broad smiles on their faces.
A warm smile, a friendly smile.
A warm smile, a friendly smile.
The waitress gave me a warm smile.
The waitress gave me a warm smile.
Welcome, said Sramam, with a friendly smile.
Welcome, said Sramam, with a friendly smile.
A faint smile, a slight smile.
A faint smile, a slight smile.
A faint smile spread across his lips.
A faint smile spread across his lips.
Give somebody a smile.
Give somebody a smile.
His mother gave him a big smile and told him not to worry.
His mother gave him a big smile and told him not to worry.
Break into a smile.
Break into a smile.
Davy's face broke into a smile when she saw her mother.
Davy's face broke into a smile when she saw her mother.
Return somebody's smile.
Return somebody's smile.
I smiled at him, but he didn't return my smile.
I smiled at him, but he didn't return my smile.
Nice to meet you too, she said, returning his smile.
Nice to meet you too, she said, returning his smile.
A smile spreads across somebody's face.
A smile spreads across somebody's face.
As she heard the news, a smile spread across her face.
As she heard the news, a smile spread across her face.
With a smile.
With a smile.
I'm fine, Rena replied with a smile.
I'm fine, Rena replied with a smile.
Have a smile on your face.
Have a smile on your face.
Kolab always has a smile on her face.
Kolab always has a smile on her face.
They all smiled at me.
They all smiled at me.
My father rarely smiles.
My father rarely smiles.
She has a nice smile.
She has a nice smile.
She smiled and said, "Good morning."
She smiled and said, "Good morning."
That's easy, Lena said, smiling.
That's easy, Lena said, smiling.
He smiled and shook my hand.
He smiled and shook my hand.
He winked and gave me a smile.
He winked and gave me a smile.
Danet smiled at him and waved.
Danet smiled at him and waved.
She gave everyone a welcoming smile.
She gave everyone a welcoming smile.
She smiled when she read his email.
She smiled when she read his email.
The memory still makes her smile.
The memory still makes her smile.
She smiled at him and he smiled back.
She smiled at him and he smiled back.
She looked up from her book and smiled at me.
She looked up from her book and smiled at me.
When he smiled at me, I knew everything was okay.
When he smiled at me, I knew everything was okay.
Theta is so cheerful, she's always smiling.
Tita is so cheerful, she is always smiling.
He smiled with relief.
He smiled with relief.
She smiled with pleasure.
She smiled with pleasure.
She smiled in satisfaction.
She smiled in satisfaction.
The doctor smiled reassuringly.
The doctor smiled reassuringly.
Likina nodded, smiling happily.
Likina nodded, smiling happily.
She smiled affectionately at him.
She smiled affectionately at him.
He smiled fondly at the children.
He smiled fondly at the children.
He smiled at me in a reassuring way.
He smiled at me in a reassuring way.
She read the message and smiled to herself.
She read the message and smiled to herself.
He smiled to himself as he looked at his new car.
He smiled to himself as he looked at his new car.
She smiled and said, "It's good to have you back."
She smiled and said, "It's good to have you back."
"I'm delighted to meet you," Vuthi said, smiling at the girl.
I'm delighted to meet you, Vuthi said, smiling at the girl.
She smiled broadly when her name was called.
She smiled broadly when her name was called.
He can make people smile just by walking into a room.
He can make people smile just by walking into a room.
My mother smiled encouragingly at me as I went up on stage.
My mother smiled encouragingly at me as I went up on stage.